Hello and welcome to the IO Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. Race has returned to the center of debates in international relations, challenging long-standing assumptions about how global politics is studied, narrated, and institutionalized. In this episode, we examine how concepts such as civilization, development, terrorism, migration, and security can reproduce racial hierarchies, even when race itself is left unnamed. The conversation explores the historical foundation of these ideas, their contemporary political usage, and the broader question of whether international relations can move beyond the racial logics embedded within the modern global order. My guest today is Dr. Somdeep Sen. Hello.
Hello, Martin. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Sen is Associate Professor in International Development Studies at the Roskilde University in Denmark, whose research explores race and racism in international relations, colonialism, liberation movement, and post-colonial theories. In 2025, Felix Berenscotter of King's College, London, published the edited volume Concept in International Relations, A New Introduction, in which students can explore 20 major concepts in international relations. Dr. Sen contributed the chapter on race, and in light of this growing international attention to the question of race and racism, this interview connects not only theoretical debates in international relations, but also contemporary cases, development, and real political issues in the contemporary world politics. Let's start with the first question. And when it comes to race, we have to add that we want to have this debate highly academic, based on research, based on evidence, because, on YouTube and all the social media, when you mention race, your video is going to be banned or something in that case. So we want to make sure that this episode is for all people. We are very professional in speaking, and we will base our discussion on that sort of academic level. You describe international relations erasure of race as willful and systemic. Those are strong words, and entire academic discipline can think, how have you developed this claim, and where can we observe that in full scale in international relations?
Well, that's a good question. I think to talk about the willful and systemic erasure of race, we need to talk about how where the discipline of international relations really comes from. And obviously, scholars much smarter than me, like Errol Henderson and Bob Vitalis, have already developed this sort of historical trajectory of the discipline, where they've shown through their work that some of the earliest monographs, some of the earliest writings in the discipline was premised on a racialized hierarchy of the global order, where they provided the rationale for maintaining Euro-American dominance and for a more subservient role for the so-called darker corners of the world. Now we can, this is easily evidenced, of course, through the works of Henderson and Vitalis, but also, these textbooks are out there in the world. Now, what started to happen with the rise of anti-colonial movements, with, say, the Greek losses against Turkey, and coming into World War I, this sort of European white civilizational superiority, this sort of premise started to be challenged. Now, the discipline responded not by entirely questioning the premise or the pretext of this hierarchy, but instead decided to divert attention elsewhere. The approach was to not explicitly address these racialized conceptions of the global order. And this is very well developed in Sankar and Krishna's work that came out about 25 years ago. So the idea was that we divert our attention away from this question of race. And in doing so, we will somehow avoid racial resentment from the darker corners of the world. That doesn't mean that because we're not talking about race, race disappeared. It was central to how our present day global order was built. But the discipline started providing a much more sanitized image of interstate relations, of great power rivalry. By doing this, what they did was that on the one hand, they diverted mainstream disciplinary attention away from histories and legacies of imperial violence and exploitation that continue today. Equally, they sort of almost naturalized this uncritical placement of the Euro-American universe at the center of our theorization of the global order. So for IR and IR analysis, the West, Europe, the global North became our starting point. And that meant that these places became our standard for development, progress, civilizational superiority of order, while the rest of the world became symbolic of dysfunction and the abnormality of global politics.
When I read the chapter and also some other works, I noticed that sometimes you say that the IR is using sort of sanitized vocabulary, development, stability, strong, weak states, global South or people from the South, and that sort of collocations. So how could we get this perspective? Is this a failure of individual scholars, or is it structural feature of a discipline, and that feature is reproduced or maybe used by others, and then it goes and develops? Because I think this is quite important to read between the lines, and this is where much of the race is written as a concept in many major works.
Again, I think you're right that this is a very important clarification to put out there. I think that my argument isn't that individuals don't have agency. We make our choices. But I would place the burden on a structural problem, right? I mean, it's a structural reality of international relations. These sorts of subtle notions of race that go into these terminology is already written into our textbooks, right? So if you look at the structure of the traditional international relations textbooks, all these critical approaches come at the back end, right? But then we know very well as students, what is the mainstream? And there's a politics to how this mainstream has been established. So it's put into our textbooks. Then what happens? It educates the future talking head, the journalist, the politician. It also educates the academic, the future academic. You come in as a junior scholar, you have a very clear understanding of what the mainstream of the discipline is. And if you want to make a name for yourself or have a career in a perpetually insecure academic space, academic job space, you need to replicate those things, right? So we need to understand, the sociology of the discipline, the politics of it, how grants are given out, what kind of knowledge is seen as valuable, as generalizable, or something that will give our students the skills so that they get the high paying job, which then they would use to, donate back to the university. So there is a whole ecosystem around that is deeply structured, right? So my suggestion would be that it is more of a structural problem. Of course, individuals are part of it, and some individuals are challenging it, but we need to focus our attention on the structures of the discipline.
I want to ask you about the race across different countries or regions. There is a Black Lives Matter, the Aboriginal Lives Matter, and we have also anti-caste activism in India. So we have 3 cases regarding the race. So how does it work across the regions, and does your framework build on north-south colonial binary, or you have more sort of holistic approach, more flexibility around race as a concept?
So in the chapter to understand the development of the discipline of international relations, that sort of binary was important in terms of how the discipline came about. But I think that through the course of the chapter, and that's why I sort of tried to bring in, Black Lives Matter, as a movement that, talks about race in the way we would sort of colloquially expect, right? But it was important to me to bring in the Aboriginal Lives Matter movement and, Dalit Lives Matter, or the anti-caste movement in India, to show that when we talk about race, it is a broader concept. It's about certain values, it's about structural hierarchies and how we challenge them, right? So for me, that binary often isn't particularly helpful, right? So if you look at, at the end of the chapter, I talk about the racialized figure of the migrant, right? By that, I mean how the term migrant or the figure of the migrant has become this empty signifier in which we put all the bad things, the bad values, the things we fear, right? Now, if we take that category and see that as racialized, and we travel elsewhere across the North-South divide, we'll see a almost an extremely familiar narrative that replicates what we're seeing, say, in the global North. I recently was in South Africa, and the figure of the migrant is racialized in a very similar way that the migrant is racialized in, say, North America or in Europe. You go to India, you'll hear similar narratives about illegal migrants and them being a drain on the resources and a security challenge. So I think that, for the purpose of the chapter, I had a much more broader understanding of race and racialization in order to, build these connections across the North-South divide. And, we're talking about a book chapter, so it seems relevant to say, when I talk to my students and they talk about two parts of the world and they say, well, these two parts of the world are different. Yes, different places are different. But what are the realities? What are the structural realities? What are the histories that could bring us together? And I think as social scientists, as IR scholars, it's important to keep an eye on that.
I think yes, because in many works, I see race as a concept which is trying to point on the differences, but not much on what connects us, as you pointed out. So that might be also interesting research stream for many scholars to research race from this perspective.
And if I can add to that, I've had these conversations. So I wrote a book on Palestine and Hamas that builds on my fieldwork in Gaza, where I talk pretty openly towards the end of the book about my own positionality as an Indian person, as a person who grew up in India, who looked up to his grandfather, who, who was, alive during the British colonial rule of India. All his, suits came from London. And we looked up to him because he was this very sort of English, gentleman, as we called him, right? And, and I've talked to, elsewhere about how, I've never lived in the UK, but how whenever I'm in the UK, I feel, I joke how, it feels like the old country because, being the metropole, it has this place in our imagination, right? So when I talk about these hierarchies, this way in which I've looked at the UK from afar, I find, very fruitful conversations with, my colleagues who've grown up working class in the UK, where some of those hierarchies that I was talking about that are racialized, that are embedded in colonial order, were ping-ponging, in our conversation when you're talking about class-based hierarchies, and as we know, the UK is an extremely hierarchical society in that sense. So it's important to have these conversations openly and honestly, to have a much more broader understanding of the world, right?
When we mention different regions, I want to ask you, when you speak with your colleagues, how do they conceptualize race as a concept in different regions? Is it that sort of globalization that it's the same or very similar, or do you see any perspectives that is worth mentioning here?
Well, I think that, a lot of times when we try to bring, say, certain conceptions of race that we may have developed, say, in the global north into a global south context or vice versa, we get very caught up in the differences and the specificities of each context. And I think it's obviously important to understand, if you're talking about the racialization of the figure of the migrant in India versus or South Africa versus the United States, it's super important to track those historical trajectories. But it's also important to recognize that ideas travel. We learn from each other, and to have that sort of intellectual openness is very important, because we will start seeing trends, we'll start seeing ways in which we can talk to each other that bodes well for any critical approach to international relations. And and sounds very pithy, but if we want to make a better world that many of our students come into the classroom to do, I think it's important to have these cross conversations, right?
And if you compare international relations theory strands, there are many. There are some mainstream, but there are sort of many relatively. Is there any higher theory strand that you consider as very important for concept of race, either on positive or more negative side? Depends what sort of perspective you have.
I mean, for me, I've been very much inspired by the works of, Robbie Shilliam, of the works of Errol Henderson, of Meera Subratnam, and a huge, Jess Mangani. A lot of these people have done, some amazing, groundbreaking work establishing these historical trajectories. And, they're also brilliant researchers, not just people who have great ideas, who are able to find the data through archival work, through ethnographic work, connect, show the long tail of colonialism, imperialism, racism. And the way in which these scholars have worked has been super helpful for me. And even though, what I've learned from them is how to use historical data, how to, establish these historical trajectories. And whilst the names I've mentioned, some of them may not work, say, on the Middle East, I've been inspired by their methods and by their approach, and see similar trends and trajectories in, say, the Middle East where I work, right?
Let's go back to the chapter, and there is 9/11, terrorism, and sort of unclear statements, or using the words in a way to address to certain groups of people without naming them. For instance, freedom, evil, civilization, and the others, or people from not America. So how do you connect this to race? And if you comment on that a little bit more, because I want to understand that connection. Terrorism is always at the security studies, people who are doing something ugly, people who have some ideology, and suddenly this appears in the chapter of race. So I want to get that connection, and why that connection? How did you develop it?
So, we saw this, we're talking about 9/11. So, in some ways, my academic consciousness, but also political consciousness, was very much tied to the events of 9/11 and the aftermath, right? So I went to university in upstate New York. So I moved from India to the US in 2003, so the year of the US invasion of Iraq. And this was the height of the war on terror, right? And, growing up, in India after 9/11, as a 16, 17-year-old, you saw this war on terror as something that was between the US and the Middle East, right? But then, obviously I had more hair at the time up top, but, me coming in with this skin color in upstate New York, which is an extremely white area of the state of New York, and it's, one of the least racially segregated counties in America. It's all Trump country now. So I felt I was at the center of this tectonic plates that were shifting, right? But I also witnessed, how quickly, I was brought into the fold of this suspect community, right? Yes, he didn't, George Bush didn't talk about race, but he talked about civilization. And there were subtle notions of, people who believe in these values and people who don't. This sort of binary conception was already, at the back, in the back of our head, right? If we watch old, Hollywood movies, how the region has been, how, say, brown, Middle Eastern looking men have been historically portrayed, this is already sitting in our head, right? So it just needed to be triggered in some ways. So, and we saw that, how it was naturalized and normalized. And because of what happened in 9/11, it meant that entire minority communities in the United States became suspect communities. There was mass surveillance. College students were being surveilled. Middle Eastern looking men, whether on TV or whether shown in the news or or at the airport, were constant suspects. As I remember trying at that time. This is even in my master's, when I was doing my master's degree, I was in Boston. I remember, at that time, my focus was political Islam. And I had my white male professor, buy a book online because I didn't want that to come straight to my name and, under my name to my address, right? So, what we looked like, presumptions about the cultures we came from, the geographies that we came from, became, again, that signifier of this Manichaean battle that the West was engaged in. That was the narrative very clearly from the war on terror, in the war on terror discourse. So bringing in terrorism there, I think that it's important that, terrorism, the term terrorism is not just a descriptor of an act of violence, right? I would say that the deployment of the terrorism discourse is about much more. Because if we go back into history, Indian independence movement fighters were called terrorists. Gandhi was considered a terrorist. Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist. But all that to say that the word terrorism is deployed to create or to trigger that conception of the globe, right? Between good and evil, that binary concept, right? So when we deploy the term terrorism, then it allows us to immediately, place the individual, the geographies that they come from, the political projects that they're fighting from, into this category of bestiality, of uncivilizedness, of disorder. And that becomes the counterpoint to who we are. People of good values, people who believe in democracy, people who believe in rights. Right?
And how do you see this dynamics or notion at the moment when you compare it when you were a student in New York? Has anything changed, or you still think that we live in that narrative and we need to move from that narrative in much better and more intelligent way?
It's funny you mentioned this, because recently I went back to a few years ago, I went back to my alma mater in upstate New York, and I was spending time with, a fellow student, or we were students together. And, he's a person of color who grew up in New York. I am, the way I look. And we were both talking about how we were both political science BA students and how terrified we were in this largely white college campus. And then talking about today, how we see our students, our kids, who are much more confident in their skin, who are much more confident in the way, are much more articulate in the way they're able to, talk about their experiences, their histories, how they navigate the world that we live in, which we didn't have the language, or maybe we came in sort of in a very naive way, and we were unprepared to deal with this, with this world. So we do see that there's a lot more voices, younger Black and brown voices, who are able to very, very smartly, in a very savvy way, articulate the experiences of, racialized communities around the world. And what's super interesting, and, something I have been very inspired by, is the way that this is intersectional. If you look at, some of the youth movements, they're talking about unemployment, they're talking about affordability, they're talking about unlivable cities, and then they're connecting it to, imperialism, racism, capitalism, settler colonialism. And we've always considered these struggles to be connected, but I feel like the younger generation is doing a much better job, articulating. That doesn't mean that some of those narratives we've seen, let's say back in the day, if we can call it, when I was a student, aren't there. Islamophobia is still, on the rise. I mean, if you see, say, Mamdani's run up to becoming the mayor of New York, I was quite shocked, because it felt like I was back in 2003. Some of the discourses that were being used, that was the same narrative that was being used at the time. And it was used, all the way around. So mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, right? At that time, 2003, our only critical news outlets was Jon Stewart's show on Comedy Central, right? So I was quite shocked that on the one hand, we do see just the very rise of Mamdani shows that you have these, much more stronger critical voices out there. But the backlash also showed that discourse, that politics, that history that we're fighting against persists, right? It has a long tail and it's still affecting life and politics today.
Edward Said's Orientalism, which you cite in a chapter, was published in 1979. And there is argument that the Western imagination of the Middle East as backward, irrational, and sort of threatening was already well established before 9/11, that the war on terror simply activated it. So, nearly after 50 years, how much has that imaginary change or shift in the mainstream Western political culture?
I mean, I would say that unfortunately, while there are, of course, a large number of critical voices, not just, scholarly voices, but, journalistic voices who are challenging those narratives and perceptions of the region, but it is still deeply ingrained in how we understand politics happening over there. There's so much literature out there on, say, the Arab Spring and how political science was not able to, predict the Arab Spring, and that was primarily because it failed to understand politics and politics of everyday life, on its own terms in the region. Right? In times of war, in times of crisis, as we are in today, in times of genocide, those we fall very quickly into those categories because these are so ingrained in what, in how we have understood the world. And as I said before, it's written into our textbooks, it's written into the curriculum. What is worrisome for me is also that there is a certain globalization of this perspective, right? So if as I mentioned, I grew up in India, so I've left India, but you can't get the love of Bollywood away from me. But if you follow the trajectory of Bollywood films and the way they replicate that terrorism discourse of how they position India vis-a-vis the terroristic Middle Easterner, or that part of the world, it's the same narratives and images are being replicated. And, obviously that's disappointing, but it's also speaks to our earlier conversation that, it's time we look beyond the north-south, binary and see how these values and images and, ideologies are traveling across the world.
Do you think that when we have race as a concept and terrorism plus Middle East, do you think that it goes just automatically without researching terrorism as what's going on in real life? Because sometimes I read works and labeling terrorism is getting to areas and issues which I wouldn't label terrorism. I would call it in a different way. So do you think that we have some sort of over-labeling using terrorism and then adding race in maybe unnamed matter?
Yes, because because that when you label it in that way, as you're saying, it is not really helping us better helping us better understand the political dynamics at play, the histories at play, the socioeconomic realities at play. It just helps categorize us versus them. When we categorize something or someone as a terrorist, it is a symbol of unequivocal evil. And history, past, present, and future, is encapsulated in that frame. So then what happens is that you as an individual, as a scholar, as a journalist, you may have no stakes in this organization or this entity. But because they have been labeled as such, any attempt to look at their historical trajectory, any attempt to understand the political context in which they operate is dismissed as either being, too relativistic, too supportive of this organization. Do you support them or do you not support them? Do you condemn them? Do you not condemn them? Which I don't think that's the job of academics, to or not to condemn, right? So I think you're absolutely right that it is this smokescreen that prevents us from really looking at what is happening. And again, like I have written about, say, the colonial roots of counterinsurgency. And if you look at, say, counterinsurgency discourses of colonial administrations, it was worked on these binaries where the anti-colonial activist was seen as unequivocally as driven by, a bloodthirst against the white colonizer, as, disorderly, as wanting to create disorder for the sake of disorder. And there is no mention of the broader national political projects, its values, its aspirations that lie behind these acts.
Do you think when you speak with your Middle East-based scholars, your colleagues, do you think that there should be sort of more research on the race coming from the Middle East itself? Because I see so many papers coming from outside the Middle East labeling things, but I sometimes feel that I need more research from authentic people living in those countries. Yeah, like for instance, if I give you a task, give me 10 papers from Oman about race and terrorism, I think we would need more tools to find some in a short time. Yeah, in maybe a long time, we can find some, but I think this is sort of underrepresented area. How do you see this? You as a scholar, as a person who is speaking with people?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is this, again, the politics of the discipline works as such, where non-Euro-American spaces are systematically marginalized, whether it's a matter of access, it's a matter of funding, it's a matter of open access. So, the visibility of these scholars are very limited. Obviously, there's amazing work that's coming out, talking about race. Lana Tatur is a great example, who's of course based in, Australia, but who's written, some really important texts about race and Palestine, right? So, so yes, there is a structural challenge here. And the way academia works, these days in the neoliberal university in the global north, where it's all about these, this publish or perish model, that we're not being given the institutional space to do the slow research, where when we're aware of, say, when we're aware of these structural biases, we're not given the space to go out there and find these perspectives, or read this literature, cite this literature, because we are being pushed institutionally to get our things out there. So that culture of slow research isn't there, right? Which makes it even more challenging, and marginalizes these voices even more.
Sometimes I speak with older scholars in their 70s, 80s, and they tell me, well, I wanted to write a book. So basically, I started 7, 8 years before I wanted to publish it, because this is how it was in the past. Today, there is the internet, but still, I think we shouldn't hurry that much to publish, because then we produce that shallow research. And as I would say the majority of that shallow research is just the overview written with some clever data construction, so it looks like a research paper. But when you read it, you find a similar one next to the I don't know, university. There is someone publishing the same thing. So I think this is very important issue that you pointed to, that long research, and I fully support field work, to go to countries, to speak with people, spend 1 or 2 years. Of course, there is no time, no money for this, because our institutions, they want points. But I think this is something we should return to, because this deep research, long research, it's for generations.
Yeah, I think this is super important that you mentioned. Also, I mean, I felt it as, starting as a PhD student at the University of Copenhagen, it was unthinkable that I was going to do field work. But then I was going to do field work in the Gaza Strip. I mean, that was just, why do you need to go and talk to these people? Why can't you just sit here and, whatever mediated reality appears on your screen, why don't you move forward from that? And I can tell you categorically that if I hadn't stepped foot, in the field, it's almost like I stepped foot, I was on the border between Egypt and Gaza, and my sort of very limited experience right then and there sort of reworked my entire PhD and how I thought about what I wanted to do. It's the same thing. You talk about an issue. So currently, I'm working on a book on landscape and the colonial politics of landscapes, right? And obviously, it builds on fieldwork in Palestine. But then, when you take that idea, and I've mentioned this to people in Greenland, in Turkey, in South Africa, in Colombia, when I've had the opportunity to travel to these places, they have their own stories that ping pong off of what is happening, in the region in the Middle East. And that tells you of these global realities. And at the end of the day, we need that space to do it, because isn't that why we got into, this discipline of international relations, right?
You have a part in your chapter about Brexit. And I want to ask you about the calculation and race, because when I go into the past retrospectively, and I read discourse like Nigel Farage about the Brexit, about the migrants in the UK, how do you think was that political calculation versus racial hierarchies sort of embed in the political culture? And do you think that it is still ongoing in the UK, or people have woken up and they said like, oh, that was a big mistake to put people like migrants from all the countries to one basket and say, look, they are the cause of the problems. But after Brexit, what sort of stage is UK at the moment? It's basically a broken country. When you go out of London and you speak with people, and you speak with people in the suburbs where poverty level, for instance, when you take children as a category, is 20-25%.
I mean, I don't think we as human beings are very good at learning from history, right? I think that if you're talking about Brexit, they didn't need to explicitly. I mean, again, in the sort of xenophobic discourse that we've seen in Europe or across Europe during the sort of migration crisis, right? Say in a place like Hungary or Poland, it was very explicitly racial, right? I mean, if you remember that Polish magazine cover of depicting Europe as this, white woman who's being then grabbed on by, black and brown people. So in some places, it was very explicitly racial, and maybe that was permissible. But of course, in a place like the UK where you have legal structures in place that where you have minority or racialized communities seen as protective groups, obviously they can't explicitly mention race. But the way we have demonized migrants historically and the way in which it has become this racialized category, I don't need to say that people from so-and-so country are civilizationally backwards. I just need to say migrants, and people understand, right? There is a general instinctive understanding of what we're talking about. It's completely normalized. So for instance, I can tell you that I was doing some field work here in Denmark where I was interviewing someone from the Ministry of Integration. And this was, in the height of Denmark's sort of anti-refugee laws. And, we were talking about the skills that refugees and migrants bring with them, right? And, the person said, it's a known fact, we know that, their engineering degrees from, say, Syria don't match up to Danish engineering degrees. And I said, so how did you know that? Did you sit down and look at the curriculum and compare? And he said, no, but, it's a known fact that, the skills you bring in from countries, from third world countries don't have as much value in a place like Denmark, right? And he was in an, formal interview with them, right? But it was instinctive to him, right? That there is something backward in that part of the world without really having to engage in, the realities of that place, right? So, yeah.
Your chapter closes by noting that gender, race, and it's a difficult concept. It's difficult because of multi-dimensional presence in politics and society. When we speak about the concept as academics, we must also critically review it. So what does that tell us about the limits of treating race as analytical category within the discipline?
Well, to me, it's less about the limits of race as a concept, but it's the limits of the discipline itself, right? Discipline that, often bases itself on clear correlations, on, one-to-one arguments, clearly generalizable. When we know that, when we incorporate questions of gender, of race, these are multifaceted, it intersects with various aspects of your life. We can't just talk about race. We have to talk about race and gender. We can't just talk about race and gender. We sometimes have to talk about race, gender, and class, right? And so this sort of fuzziness, the issue is that that's not an anomaly. That's the reality of the world we live in, right? Except we are limited by a discipline that wants very clear, clear replicable arguments. So for me, international relations, a discipline that is supposed to help us theorize how we relate to each other, is structurally often unable to create provide us the space for doing that. And that's the reality also of the majority of the world. So it's more an indication of the deficiency of the discipline itself.
We mentioned race, we mentioned several concepts across the region and limitation. And now I would like to ask you about the decolonizing IR and the role of race. How do you see this as a research discipline? And perhaps what's the positives and negatives when we speak about race associated with decolonialization?
I think race is one of the many concepts that can help us, recover the colonial and imperial histories that went into the makings of the discipline. It can help us, point out how these legacies continue in shaping how we operate within the discipline, what kind of topics we privilege, what are the things we ignore, what are the regions we talk about, and what are the regions that are seen as marginal, right? And what are the problems and crises in the world we see as part of the mainstream? So I think that, race can allow us to do that, but it's also about, encouraging us to be more open and substantively engage with other perspectives, other philosophical traditions, other ways of understanding the world. Again, you may think, sitting in Copenhagen or London, that a certain problem, a certain world crisis, a certain crisis is a global crisis. And you travel to the rest of the world and you realize how much of a limited space that crisis occupies, in their sort of, public sort of domain, right? So it's important it's not just about tokenism. It's not just about, bringing someone in from the non-West, so to speak, who then just replicates whatever the mainstream is saying. But it is to bring in a different experience of the world, right? So race, I believe, is one of the concepts that can allow us to do that.
And I would like to link this answer with the next question, and that's about Beijing, about China. And Beijing positions itself as a champion of the global south. And many times it says, oh, this is sort of anti-hegemonic force against the Western dominant United States, Western Europe. But also we know how certain minorities are treated in China. So how do you see China as a case for the research with the race as a concept?
Yeah, I'm always very skeptical of these claims that China is somehow championing the global south. I think that these sorts of discourses are, again, used to maintain that binary conception of the world. But it is also, weaponized to, let's say, weaponized against legitimate criticism of the politics of some of these regimes. You see that, for instance, in India, every time, questions are raised about the human rights record of this current regime, of the turn to the right, of the democratic downsliding in the country. Often we use sort of the anti-colonial, post-colonial discourse to evade some of the criticism. So I think that when we look at a place like China, we should be careful. We shouldn't hurry to quickly treat it or any other country as the natural, champion of the global south, primarily because, as you say, its own history, and we should be aware of that. But that also should remind us, or we should recount why we espouse these as scholars who talk about race, colonial histories, post-colonialism, we should go back and ask us what is the moral, academic, but also political grounding of this work. And we should just as, we are not talking about these critical approaches because we have this inherent antagonism towards the West. So we should be open to and brave to, see, critique a country like China, and its human rights record, and not fall into the North-South binary and then ignore the atrocities, and in doing that, undermining the moral, ethical, political values that have pushed us to do this work in the first place.
When you mention global north and global south binary, I want to ask you about the racial hierarchies operates outside. There are more intensive cases in southern societies like India, Latin America, even Africa. We have those articles from the South Africa where people from Ghana are sort of like excommunicated from the societies in South Africa because of some problems and others. So how should IR engage with intra-Southern racial hierarchy based on your research and experience?
Yeah, again, I mean, it's important, of course, to say the case of South Africa to understand what has its trajectory, political, socioeconomic trajectory been, in the lead up to, say, the xenophobic attacks we're seeing today. And it's important to not collapse different histories, different contexts together. But if we are talking about race being this category that helps us understand hierarchies of marginalization, of historical stigmatization, then we should look for applicability of these concepts across the North-South divide, especially in this era of the global right, we are seeing an extreme level of collaboration across the North-South. Those of us who espouse a critical approach to international relations, we see ourselves as quite cosmopolitan, and we're so pluriversal, and we take perspectives from all over the world, right? What we are witnessing is that the global right is equally cosmopolitan, right? For instance, I mean, in the US, Elon Musk's Doge was very much inspired by Argentina's Milei and his chainsaw policies. There's a reason why Milei was at Donald Trump's inauguration. Modi and Trump talk to each other. Similar discourses about terrorism travel across the North and South. Similar xenophobic discourses travel in India, South Africa, US, UK. So we need to, more than geographical divisions, we need to talk about morals, we need to talk about values, we need to talk about historical hierarchies, marginalization, and so forth, as a way of guiding our research rather than it being divided by, it being overly determined by its northness or its southness.
Let's go for a minute outside of the chapter and the topics, and I would like to touch a bit of methodology because we have an experienced researcher here. So what would be your recommendation for research methods when it comes to race as a concept?
If we look at, if I look at my background as a student, when I was a bachelor student, I was at a liberal arts university in the US, which encourages interdisciplinarity, right? But, it was also an environment, at the university, it was an environment where we were encouraged to go and ask people how they're experiencing the world, right? As that being, a valuable data point for us to understand politics, society, what it may be, right? So I think that, since then, since I was, since 2003, I have always espoused sort of a qualitative approach, but ethnography has been a big part of my work. It's not to say that I don't use, say, archival research, not to say that I don't use sort of historical text, media, videos, so on and so forth. But I think that a lot of times the granular everyday is an important place to start for understanding that sort of global, the global scope. Because at the end of the day, I feel like what happens there intimately informs that everyday, and the everyday often intimately informs how politics happens at that level. So for me, despite it not having the value of the big N data set, right? I think there is something very compelling about capturing the everyday experiences with all its nuances, the idiosyncrasies. But that's what the world is. It's idiosyncratic, right? It's never a clear correlation between A and B. So it's important. For me, it's very important. So it's always been very important to be in the field, talk to people, ask them about my ideas, get challenged, follow their stories, give value to their stories. And even though they may not, fit the majority of the data, recognize that their worldview is shaped by those stories, right? There's a famous American poet who wrote that the world is not, maybe I'm paraphrasing here, but the world is not made of atoms, it's made of stories, right? And these stories are super important. And I think that, we need to bring this culture of storytelling back into the discipline if we want to, capture the multiplicity of experiences and histories and challenges and conflicts that make up global politics today. But I think that there is, it goes back to our early conversation about, the time it takes us to do the research, the way in which we conduct our research, to give it time to give it time to percolate, to So I think the in this push to publish or perish, we're losing that, the real soul of what we are here to do, right? And I think that gives you lines on your CV, but in the long term, it doesn't leave us with perspectives and stories that can foundationally shape how we understand the world, right? I mean, at the end of the day, many of us who got into academia, a very underpaid job, a very insecure job, are those perspectives, are those stories that I personally keep going back to. So I think that we need to, and we always say that, hey, we'll go back to it after tenure happens. We'll go back to it when we're full professors. But it never happens, right? It's a matter of habit. It's how we do our work, right? So it's important to go back to that.
The last question for today's interview, and I would like to ask you about some under-researched areas regarding race, something that maybe you are working on or you would recommend to scholars, to researchers to have a look, because you consider that particular area as very interesting and very promising for the research.
Well, I think that, we need to go beyond the sort of the traditional conception of race, right? And how, if we understand it, the racialization of identities and categories of ethnicities, I think that's an important area to focus, especially in the global South. I think that there's not enough research, or there could be more research on, say the racialization of the figure of the migrant, right, which we would typically associate with the global North. But we're seeing similar dynamics in, like I said, in South Africa, but also in a place like India. Think about how studies of racism, of racialized community in the US are relevant? What are the intersections? What are the disjunctures in our discussions about, say, minority communities in India, or caste struggles, or my caste-based discrimination, right? And I think it's important to open up these conversations and resist the urge to say, well, these two places are different. You can't just apply, an American model on India or something like that. But think about place, and obviously not everything is the same, right? But think about the places where we can collaborate and think with each other rather than against.
Dr. Sen, many thanks for sharing your research insights with us, for talking about the chapter in the book. And also, I appreciate your holistic view of race as a concept, which I think it's much appreciated today. Because as people are moving, as countries are changing, and geopolitics is pushing and shifting so many concepts, I think we should really understand the race from that holistic perspective, and not to go just to the binary research or binary dimension. So I think that holism is important, and I wish you good luck for research, for your work, for writing, and we'll expect articles and possibly books coming from you. And also I will list all of the current publications that you have in the YouTube description, because there are some very interesting publications. Again, many thanks for being on the IR Thinker, and good luck in your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin.